Massachusetts in 1987. Her experience has drawn from working in the UK, China, and Japan, where she discovered architecture, the US, where she grew up, and Taiwan, where she was born. She was a quality review panelist for the Euston HS2 station and London Legacy Development Corporation. She has taught as a unit master at Architectural Association School of Architecture, the University of Westminster and London Metropolitan, and has been an external examiner at the Bartlett School of Architecture and at the University of Dundee. She is also a trustee of Open City Charity, which is a visiting practice charity, a visiting practice professor at Sheffield School of Architecture, and an MArch external examiner at London Metropolitan University. And along with Anna, we have Mike Tonkin. Mike Tonkin qualified as an architect in 1989, which is also the year he set up his practice. And he graduated from the Royal College of Art in London in 1986 after receiving first-class honors at Leeds Polytechnic, having completed an apprenticeship as an architectural technician with training at Bath Technical College. His interest in nature led to his qualification as a landscape architect in 2014. He has taught for many years, including for a decade at the University of Bath and as a unit master at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, the University of Westminster and London Metropolitan. He has been an external examiner for the master's courses at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London, and a long-standing visiting critic. He completed his PhD at the University of Bath and is currently a visiting professor of architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. And together they run Tonkin Liu Architects, which looks at or is focused around bridging teaching, research, and practice. And they use placemaking as a design approach. And the firm has established a reputation for delivering award-winning projects that range from architecture to medical interventions and from artworks to landscapes. So with that introduction, I'm very eager to look at the range of works that both Anna and Mike do, and I'll invite both of you to share with us your works. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to start off by telling you a story about a performance. And to do that, I'm going to take you to a tropical island in the South Pacific, and I'm going to tell you a story about a seed. The seed comes from this flower. This flower is called the Burlingtona asiatica. It's an enormous flower, and it only flowers at night, and it only flowers one flower at a time. And it's propagated by a giant moth. And the giant moth finds it because the scent of it is absolutely amazing, and it percolates for about a mile. And but the giant moth is a thing in itself, it's huge. But the outcome, when the seed is germinated, is a very interesting seed. It's a globe, but around that globe is a triangular pyramid with a square plan. And I'm going to tell you why it's that form. If you take a round ball, if any of you ever played water polo, you'll know that it doesn't matter how much force you put on the ball will spin in the water. And if any of you have ever tried to row a boat that's round, you will know that it's very easy to just go round in circles. So if you make a seed with a square plan, what's really good about the square is that when the water pushes it upon it, it's going to kind of do this and then suddenly shift to here, where the water will push on two sides of it, and it will start to push through the water. So the front will push through the water, and the back will be pushed. So that's the first thing about it. So that's why there's a square seed. The second thing about it is, if you've ever been in a sailing boat, if you don't have a keel on a sailing boat, the sailing boat will turn over when the wind blows. So this has been blown through the water by the wind, and the seed has a sort of dip in it, so it has a keel. And that keel has a long thing that comes off the back of it, that acts like a rudder. But when it floats in the water, it floats with its shoulders above the water, so that the wind catches the shoulders, so the shoulders are blown through the water. Inside the seed, around the globe, is a kind of perforated foam, and that perforated foam acts like a kind of sponge element that keeps the seed up in the water. It's also really interesting that foam is poisonous to fish. And in the Philippines, they use this to catch fish. They use that foam, they put it in the water, the fish can't breathe, and the fish will come to the surface and they take the fish out. So fish know that this seed is poisonous, so you'd have to be a very big fish because this seed's about this big. So the seed is kind of safe. And once it's in the water, this seed can stay in water for up to 5 years. No, sorry, up to 15 years it can stay in water. And it can travel up to 5,000 miles just drifting by the currents. And that's how far it's been known to travel. So over time, evolution has made this form into something that we know as of a boat, or we know of, all the things we've learned about sort of through craft. And actually, what's amazing about the materiality of it is it's waterproof, but when it lands on that far shore, the seed is actually germinated by rainwater, because rainwater actually germinates it. It doesn't germinate in salt water. So the reason I'm showing you this is because, in a way, it's a story that's kind of cyclical, and it's a story that's a kind of performance, and it's a story that's actually about form related to function and how everything has a purpose. And that is a process. So we could say it's a design process, but actually it's called evolution. So this seed might be 200 million years old and it's been refined over time. But nature does that constantly. So many things in nature are designed through time and evolve into the sort of optimum form. So as architects, we believe that actually we can look at nature and learn so much from nature, but also we have to have a design process, and that design process needs to be kind of quite organized on what you're going to do. So we're going to show you a series of steps, and Anna's going to take you through some of the first steps, and then I'm going to take you through some of the last steps. So Anna's going to take over.
So the 4 stages of this process, I suppose, has evolved over time, and there are 2 aspects about it. It's very much about story. So you'll see roughly these stages kind of expand and contract, roughly equating to RIBA work stages. So at the end of this, you get an entity that is the building, but the beginning is the client's brief. So we question, the first thing is to question. I love that actually many of you do that here. So not take anything for granted. We expanded on the 3 pillars of nature, people, place, and we end up with a set of riddles. And what we mean by riddles is the most curious things about the brief and the nature and the people, place. And that leads us to then look at visual influences and expand again on nature, people, place, and end up with a set of quests. So when you look at the riddles, the quests, they lead you to start playing with form and propositions, which is the 3rd stage. And what you're looking for is a sort of archetype. And why archetypes? Because again, it leads back to this idea that you get stories. And stories are, in a way, they sort of transcend the brief and the kind of constructional realities. Then they really motivate, whether it's your clients, your engineers, or your contractor, they motivate people to sort of strive for something that perhaps they've never tried before. And so all the way through, we're chasing stories that will lead us to somewhere new and somewhere we never tried before. And you'll see, hopefully, technically, we are chasing that story through to the end, to the sort of detail level. At the AA, we began looking at natural form and again, abstracting stories from looking at the form and making experiments. So it's not mimicking nature, but mimicking the principles of nature. Mike did his PhD on this, further elaborating on this idea of stories and mythology and why that's important for architecture. We use it in design competition process, so this sort of roughly maps out the nature, people, place, and asking questions through sort of time perspective. What is something? That's often the current reality of something, and it's often not good enough. That's why there's a project. What was something? And this doesn't mean the kind of historic past. It actually, what we're chasing is a sort of origin story. So, maybe it's kind of deep past. And what could it be, which is the future? And thinking with your imagination, what are the challenges, but also the exciting potentials that could be presented in the future. So really, it's not a kind of research, factual process. It's all the way through. You have to use your imagination and looking for a story. This is another example of another competition we won for a big project in Grosvenor Square, which is now on site. So here we took the client's brief, we abstracted it into these kind of more general ideas, but we also told them a story about 7 oval seas, which we drew up in a kind of cartoon format, and we told the story about the square into a beautiful garden, but full of sort of intricacies and... Sorry? Okay, but it has a narrative. It has a very strong ambition responding to the client's request to think about climate change. So we turned that into this sort of ambitious idea for creating an underground rainwater cistern, which I haven't got the section here. But so generally in London, a typical Georgian square has mature trees around the perimeter. So we densely populate the space under the tree with a lot of lush woodland plantings. So we turn that into a woodland. In the woodland, we create these clearings, which are for social gatherings. So all those white ovals are for people. So people with nature, immersed in nature. And in the middle is an open space, open to the skies, people who love the sun. And at one end of it is what we call the hidden wonder, which is for the journey of that drop of rain that comes from all the streets all around. In a way, the metaphor of sort of this quite attractor and a sort of focal point for people and for nature. So the rain journeys through the garden, and we work with incredible ecologists and hydrologists who said that with planting, you can really cleanse that water, that polluted water from the streets, bring it down here and store it underneath the ground for reuse. And this, in a way, is a really exciting prototype or a kind of case study for spaces that are open in the city but are slightly underused. So to begin with, the asking process, how we redefine the brief into riddles. When you look at each of the pillars, nature, people, place, each one is then subdivided into 4 aspects. So when you look at nature, don't just look at one scale of it. So quite often we are looking at the geography, which means the sort of natural setting, the everything that's not human, so the geology, the geography. Elements, we often try to see what's special about this place. Is it the wind, the sunlight, the rain? And increasingly, architects are using these elements as resources, solar energy or water catchment. But they also animate architecture. So we quite often kind of focus on the sensuous awareness and the patterns and the texture and the sound you get from the elements. Symbols, you might have noticed a lot of our projects use symbols as the title, natural symbols. So that, again, in a way, brings us to a place where it gives the project and the community a new identity. And that new identity is derived from nature, which is kind of universally quite an empowering thing. And finally, lessons, which comes to the more biomimetic aspect of what we do in our work. So you see some examples of this. And that time perspective in each aspect is incredibly important, because you don't want to get stuck on nostalgia or the problems, the current problems. You want to sort of combine all of them and take you somewhere else. People, it's not just the people who use it or the person. It's not just the neighborhood. It's not just the company who's commissioning it. it's also the society, which is the global society, the collective responsibility we have as a community, a wider community. And we would say that now, more than ever, that responsibility lies in responding to climate change. That's it. So asking redefines the brief, and riddles, so we end up with a number of riddles that launches the next stage. And, oops, this is a bit mixed up, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. And finally, place is about sort of the physical realities, the cultural, what is the program, and what does that mean? You know, so when it's a school, what do people do in a school? They talk about things, they meet, they interact. So that kind of type and activity, so all these things are interrogated. You ask questions about each one of these. So this first project I'm going to show you is a sculpture on the hilltop in the north of England. The original brief was to create panopticons, which is an all-seeing building on the top of a hill. But we really questioned that and challenged that, because we didn't think looking on top of the hill was the most important thing. And what we found was, in a very simple way, wind was the most important element. And it was kind of put in a very disparaging way. There's nothing but wind there. And in a way, many of our projects are about regenerating the place, a quite rundown place, a place not just physically has lost its cohesiveness, but also lost its kind of social cohesion. So it's about reinventing that identity. And we eventually sort of distill these questions into these riddles, which is about how do you make the invisible wind visible? How do you amplify? How do you turn wind into a positive aspect rather than something people shy away from? And how do you get people out of the town up to the hill? So that's a view of the hill, and the eventual sculpture effectively are pipes that lean into the wind. And so just want to show you how that story then led us on a long journey, experimenting with different length pipes. Here you see the kids are making different cuts to see what sort of sound that makes. But also technically, on the right, you see a technical drawing showing how thin that cut, that sort of lip of the pipe cut is. And we had to invent a particular drill, a tool to do that. So that story could lead you to doing something quite experimental, very engaging, but also technically interesting. And it ended up on the Burnley's OS map, which is actually suggests that it really sort of, the community has taken ownership of this new identity. The second stage is about looking at visual influences. And we at this point, still shy away from looking at architectural precedents. We want to look through the perspective of many, what we call them, protagonists. And I'll show you a sort of table of that. And what this stage does is, at the end, sets the sort of architectural intent. So to show you how we've done this, I'm going to show you a project we completed in South London, a bridge project. The original client is a community group that raised the money through mayor's funding, and they were adamant they needed a bridge to get them to this island in the park in order to help them preserve these dinosaurs, which are grade 1 listed structures. And there's a reason for this. So this is an example of how you expand this process into, again, nature, people, place, but within that you role play the perspective of a climatologist, an ecologist, biologist, geologist, people, psychologists, anthropologists, and you try to look at how they might see the project. And so with that, so quite often we're looking at visual influences. So we call this the wall of inspiration. When we look, we're kind of putting all these things on the wall. And when they're on the wall, we then begin to make connections between them and begin to make threads that lead us to three, sometimes more, a set of quests. And that quest, a bit like a story, is what you set out to achieve with your architecture. So, for example, what we looked at, one of the things we looked at was how the island was laid out with these dinosaurs. And the significance of these dinosaurs, one-to-one dinosaurs, is that they were put there by the Victorians as the first example of educational entertainment, meaning they engage people to learn about dinosaurs, about science, but in a very direct, empirical way. And we like the fact that it began showing sort of an evolutionary timeline in these islands. So we proposed, we had an option of putting a bridge there or there. We proposed that our bridge should go at the beginning of the timeline. So pre-dinosaur. We also looked at what came before dinosaurs, and one of the things we explored was this sort of this idea of the bony fish and the evolution of form. You know, so when we began to make clay models, plasticine models, paper models, we looked at how to evolve that form so that not only is it strong, but it also begins to kind of take shape for what it needs to do. So the other inspirations are these sort of primordial organisms that that are inherently strong. And I suppose as architects, you often have these multiple influences in your head. And one of them is that we know from experiences sort of strength in form, but also at the back of our mind always is this idea that the budget is very small, the client is having to raise the funding from different sources. So we came up with a solution. The innovation here is also how do you build in a minimal way using minimal material and minimal costs. So we took sheets of steel and cut them into strips. One strip came up to form the balustrade, one lay flat, and one went down to form the beam connecting to the central beam. And that's it being made in the workshop. And what's really lovely is a local fabricator, local to the site, approached us because of the kind of profile of the project for fundraising. They knew about it, and they committed themselves to helping us build this. And that's it getting craned into site. And the other thing, and again, this goes back to the riddle, it is a bridge, but they wanted to be a bridge that wasn't a bridge because the client wanted to be able to close it off. So some of the options we explored when we played was putting gates or making it out of pieces so that sometimes you cannot access the island. Only when you want to can you access the island. But in the end, we arrived at this solution, which is about swinging it across only when you need it. So normally it's parallel to the bank, a bit like a sort of floating sculpture. The third project covers a bit of playing. So the form finding is about chasing that archetype and what is the appropriate archetype. And in a way, this is touching upon idea of symbols. Architectures do make symbols, and they do evoke emotions in people when they're kind of recognizable archetypes. This is a tower for an energy center in Manchester. So the brief is a 40 meters tall tower that holds up the 5 chimneys that expels the air from this new low carbon energy center. And so in the playing part, here you see that we are looking at the setting, the massing, the circulation, how do people and things move through it, and the typology. And we often are thinking of both the sort of poetic and the pragmatic side of these aspects. And here you see they're very small, but you see plasticine clay models, stocking model, they're often very, very crude. And I think there's a lot of value in exploring early stage options with your hands, because your hands are quick, are intuitive, and they don't lock you into a sort of one-to-one scale, which is what computers do. And ultimately, you're looking for, oops, I'm going backwards again. From the looking stage, we were looking at things in nature that are strong. So this is a glass sponge with incredibly delicate lattice work. Bamboo, which is tall, but has these horizontal diaphragm walls, as you know. And this is a cactus that has these sort of diagrids, and extremely tall plants that are vertical because they want to have the sort of minimal heat. And so here you see how crude these early stage models are. They tell you a lot. And then we go into the computer, and we're again exploring different typologies. And here's where we suddenly sort of dawned on us that actually adopting this technique that we had invented in 2009 called shell structure seemed to be the right type, because the client was very interested in creating a symbol of nature that disseminates the message for sort of a new future for Manchester. So since 2009, when we discovered the technique, it was about combining tailoring with laser cutting and being able to make quite complex form, but always with flat sheet materials, and therefore quite a sort of affordable way of doing this. So since 2009, we've done bridges, ferry terminals, pavilions. Probably half of these won the competitions, and a number of them have been built. So here you see the principles of it is observing these structural principles in nature that enable shells to be sometimes incredibly lightweight using super thin material, and tailoring. When you cut flat sheets in these complex shape and then join them at the seams, they form very, very stiff form, three-dimensional foam. So all the projects I showed earlier, the sort of 15 projects in the evolution, have been engineered by Arab, our partner in this process. And so each one has been calculated with a certain thickness. This particular one, spanning 40 meters, is only 6 millimeters thick. So that's very, very efficient in terms of using little material. It's also orientated so as to sort of direct the wind and minimize the wind load. And that's it in the fabricator's workshop. And I think what's lovely is a digital process. In the end, it's this Phil, this man here, who's one of the most veteran welders. He's one of the only two people trusted enough to stitch weld the structure together. So they're ready to leave the factory. And even at competition stage, we have to think about, well, how do you transport it, and what's the most logical way? And a bit like with the bamboo, in between we can introduce the diaphragm walls to help span that. And here with the base of the energy center, the council also wanted us to create something special, and we work with another local fabricator in terracotta tiles, and learning from them that each time they make a mold could be used 25 times. So therefore, after that 25th times, we can make a new mold. And so here we made these different types that went from flat to very undulated. And there they are, from quite flat to quite sort of three-dimensional. And again, ultimately finished by hand for someone who loves and can discern the quality of the finished construction. I'm going to pass you over to Mike to show you two more projects and conclude with a competition project.
So this project is a conversion of a water tower. You have a lot of water towers here in India, and this is an unusual one because it's made of metal. So this is a really interesting village that has 3 really amazing ruins, and then our friend bought the 4th ruin, which is a metal water tower, and he wanted to live in this water tower. So he was adamant he wanted to live in the tank and he wanted to sleep in the tower. So we had to kind of find a way of making that happen. Something about the client, he's a photographer, and he's very concerned with detail. He takes detailed photographs, and he wanted to have a building that was actually connecting him to nature. So this building is like, well, how do we do that? So how do we take this rusty tank and turn it into a kind of habitable space? So through the process, asking, looking, playing, making, we explore a whole series of different alternatives, and we test those with the client, so the client's happy on which one we're doing. And then when it comes to making, we break the building down into a set of what we call a family of parts, and each part then has a different story, and we call it a script, just as you would have a character in a play would have a script, and their personality is developed through the script. We develop the personality of a particular part of a building through talking about it and discussing it and exploring the material and the technique to make the experience. So that's what I'm going to show you. So here's how the building breaks down into the tank, the tower, what we do with the frame, and the staircase that serves the spaces. So the first space I'm going to show you is the tank. And the tank, it was an amazing space, but it was very claustrophobic. And as we showed you, it's kind of made up of panels, and most panels are just 10 mil thick. And it's on the top of a hill, so you can imagine when you go on top of a tank, you get an incredible view of the horizon. So we said to Dennis, well, wouldn't it be great if we just took out one line of panels and we connected you back to the horizon? And we worked with the engineer, Mervyn Rodriguez, and he said we could support the top of the tank from the window frames alone. So steel posts were put in where the windows are, and these posts then separated the top of the tank to the bottom of the tank. And then on the outside of those steel plates, we put a truss. So basically there was a truss above and a truss below so that it couldn't go into kind of torsion. And then once that had been done and it was all ready, then Dennis and his son, with a large sledgehammer, smashed out the panels one by one. And they started at one corner in the morning and they went all the way around until at the end of the day, they'd basically brought the horizon into the tank. So the horizon literally comes into the tank, but one of the disadvantages in that is you get a kind of glare. So what we said to him is, oh, we need to put a skylight in the middle of the room. And we didn't want to put a big skylight because it would be expensive and he didn't want to use too much heat. So we put a smaller skylight, and we then surrounded that skylight by mirrors. And what's nice is Dennis then made a film, and that film basically shows what it's like when the sort of sun is passing and the clouds are passing over the top, and also when it rains you get the rain landing on the top of it and the light coming through the rain as well. So that's an experience of the sky, but it also means that you get a changing light inside the tank, so the reflections are always changing, so it doesn't matter what time of day it is, the sun is always in there. And then in a way this sort of cut shows you how the building kind of connects to the horizon. And what's beautiful about that is you see the birds, so it's like a sort of bird hide lifted into the sky, but also you see the storm coming. So when the storm's coming, they see it from miles and miles away, and it then approaches the tower, and that's when they start to feel the tower move. So that was our next job, is we had to stop the tower from moving in the storm. So the frame is incredibly delicate, and the tank is about the size of half of this room, and it's about the same height as this room. And when you imagine that's full of water, the weight of that tank is so heavy, but actually it moves very little. It just sways a little bit like that. But even a little bit like that's not good for a house because you'd get seasick. So we had to stop it from swaying. And we did that by putting timber panels inside the frame. And those timber panels made kind of cubic rooms. And those cubic rooms, instead of pointing towards the village, we pointed them north, away from the village, so they looked out over the cornfield. So in a way, we wanted those rooms to be a kind of focus on the cornfield, because the cornfield's about a kind of mile long and wide, and it's when we were up there, it's really, really beautiful. And when you're stood on top of the tank, you see this cornfield blow in the wind, and it's like watching the wind over the sea. So that was something we wanted to kind of emphasize. And we wanted the rooms to be these sort of barley-coloured rooms, but looked at the barley. So that was something that was important. And we didn't want the light pollution from this massive window to actually pollute the village. So we just wanted it to go out over the field. So the window is just pointing north and it only illuminates the field. So you see it as a kind of beacon on the horizon, but you don't see it when you're in the village. It's all kind of dark. And then you've got this one big window, but of course you can't open it. So what we did is we put a kind of smaller window down at the bottom and a higher window up at the top. So you let the cool air in at the bottom and you let the hot air out at the top. And the window at the top is on the kind of mezzanine level, and it's also a square. So when the sun comes up, the sun comes through that window, and it creates a square sun on the opposite wall. And then we talked about the building coming kind of back into nature, and we want the building to be like a kind of ruin. It's a sort of modern ruin. So it's clad on the outside by wriggly tin, which is a kind of super shiny wriggly tin, so it reflects back the light. And so if it's misty, it's kind of misty, and if it's the sun setting, then the sun sets off it. But we're also planted it with Boston ivy, and Boston ivy turns red in autumn. So in autumn, the whole building will kind of glow red. So it'll kind of activate seasonal change. So there it is, sort of in the evening light as it's sort of changing. And then what you see here is Dennis put a clock on the back of it because he wanted to. So the people in the village look up at the clock. So it's like a sort of massive clock tower. And when we had to put the stair tower outside of a tank because we couldn't go through the structure of the tank. But by doing that, we managed to hold the tank, and we're kind of clinging it from the back and stopping it from turning. And another thing we did with the stair tower is we knew the stair tower had to stabilize it, but we also used the stair tower to cool it. So in Yemen, you know, they build mud buildings that are 8 stories tall, and the stairs of those buildings act like a thermal chimney, and as the air rises up through the thermal chimney, it pulls the hot air out of the rooms and flushes it out. So we did exactly the same thing here. So we put no windows in the stair tower. We just let the stair tower act like a kind of funnel that takes air upwards. But the second thing we did again in terms of biomimicry, we're learning from nature. On a seashell, if you put the pressure onto a shell, the force goes into the middle of a shell to what's called a compression spiral, and that's how the loads are distributed inside the shell. So the stair here is actually a compression spiral, and that's made out of a kit of pieces. When you make a cross-laminated timber building, which this is, the cross-laminated timber is only 80 millimeters thick. That's sort of 3.5 inches. And this building's 4 stories tall, so those are incredibly thin walls. But because the stair is a structural component of it, it becomes incredibly stiff. So by making a compression spiral, not only do you make the walls thinner, but you take the loads straight down through and straight into the ground. And you do that from using the leftover wood from where all the windows have been cut out. So it's very cost effective and very economical. And the system to build it, when we talk about a family of parts, each one of those things has a kind of poetry in the making that's about economy and delight. And so this system was actually very easy. And 2 men, Ben and Nigel, men that Dennis met in the pub, they built the stair in 4 days. They started at the bottom, 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom, and as they went up and just kept drilling it, and they got to the top, and the whole stair is finished. And then the rods you saw in the tank that stopped the tank spilling out like this, those rods were then used as the balusters. So the balusters become the details. So again, money is saved. And actually, that tank bit we showed you that got cut out, Dennis put that into the lawn around the building, and to make a terrace. But he called it a terrace. And if you look up at the stair tower, that stair tower, it looks, because each step is made out of 2 steps, you get much more of a kind of spiral of it. So that spiral is sort of emphasized, and that's where the air is flowing up through the tower. So that's what the tower looks like, and you can see straight through the tower where the cut is, and that's what the tower is like. So that's Dennis and Monsieur, the clients, in the tank at the top there. And those funny objects, they're what used to be in the water tower. That's where they put the chlorine to keep the water safe. So, and then the last project I'm going to show you is one we've just finished. This is the biggest project we've done in terms of architectural projects. It's actually 2 buildings. And these 2 buildings together are they're both for stonemasons. One is a high-tech center, and it has the most high-tech cutting saws you can get, a 5-axis cutting saw and a bridge saw and a digitally controlled hand saw. And they cut up the large blocks into smaller blocks, So the building at the bottom there is the High-Tech Centre, right next to York Minster Cathedral. And the second one is called the Heritage Quad. And in the Heritage Quad, the smaller blocks that have been cut down by from the bigger blocks in the tech are then finished by hand. So I'm just going to show you the building. So both of these buildings, the structure is the thing that's most important. And if you ever go into a cathedral and you watch people, they walk through the door and they look up and they get their cameras out and they photograph the roof. Because in a structure, it's all about structure and geometry and light. So we wanted our two buildings to be about structure and geometry and light. And that's the sort of theme. So the asking, looking, playing, making process kind of gave us the story and gave us that as a kind of focus. And that focus was about the cathedral. This is York Minster, which is a really, really beautiful building. It's in what's called the perpendicular Gothic, which is sort of everything is emphasized and the structure is expressed. And in York, almost all the buildings are made of timber. So it's about the buildings expressing their construction. So when you look at it, you understand how it's made. So we wanted to make a building that was didactic in the same way, that you can look at the building and you completely understand how and why the building was made. And on a symbolic level, in the cathedral, there's this beautiful stained glass that's about kind of radiating light. And there's a chapter house, but when you look up in the chapter house, it's also about kind of radiating light. So we wanted to make a building that was about radiating light. So the plan of a building is simple, it's orthogonal. And I'm going to show you how we then take a building apart. So we break it down into these 8 fundamentals, as we call them, that give us that family of parts. And I'm not going to show you all of them, I'm just going to show you the important ones. So in a way, the structure is what I was talking about. We're going to make this sort of radial structure. So you take the radial beams, and the radial beams all come across, and then we make a cradle bracket. And it's a very cost-effective thing because you can put the beam in the bracket, and it can go like this, it can spin like that, and it can move up and down like that. So with one simple bracket, we can do an X, a Y, and a Z. So it's an incredibly simple way of making quite a complex form. And then the whole roof is actually made out of straight pieces. So those straight pieces are just dropped in by a crane. And actually the crane can do that really quickly. And each of the pieces is prefabricated and comes from a factory, CNC cut to exactly the right size, the right width, the right length, the right angles. And each one's tagged with the right number. So digital fabrication makes it. And then the last one kind of flattens it. But actually what's really happening, you're going to understand through the next image. So we kept the existing structures that were on the site because actually in England now almost all our projects are kind of reuse or redevelopment of existing structures. There's very little new build that's happening. So the red buildings is what we kept, and the pink buildings, they were defective, so they were demolished. So these are the existing buildings. And in the brief, when you get a client's brief, quite often the client, they haven't designed the building, so they haven't really used the design process to actually refine the brief. So in the brief, they said they wanted to put the workshop, the yellow building, in where we say the apprentices are. And because we said actually, one of the things in the brief, it said, we want you to connect the people in the workshop to the people on the city wall, because the city wall around York, it's a Roman city wall, and it has 1 million visitors a year. And one of the remits of the client was to actually make the public see the building and interact with the masons, and also for the masons to be seen by the public. It's a two-way street. So we said the brief should change, and actually you should swap it around, because the apprentices don't want to be stared at. They want to be hidden. They want to be in the garden. They want to be on the quiet side. And they want to be on the east side where the sun comes up. So basically we swapped the brief round, and by breaking the rules, we kind of won the competition. So we lift the building up towards the city wall, so the people on the city wall can see in. Coincidentally, it just happened to be north, so it also fills the room with north light, so that was lucky for us. And then the other thing we did is we lifted the building up so that the masons who were in the workshop can see the cathedral, so we lifted it up towards the south. And here's looking up towards the city wall, and you can see the city wall has these ramparts on, castellated ramparts. And we did the same thing here. We were talking outside how the bamboos lifted off the ground. We did the same thing here. When you make a timber building, you want to lift it off the ground. So we lifted off the ground by 500 mil, and we did that with a kind of castellation. So the posts all land on the building, and this is where the apprentice rooms are, and then the roof swoops up to the city wall. So this is where you see the roof swooping up to the city wall, and this is the apprentices sitting outside their rooms. And there's the structure. So the back square lifts up, and the circle lifts up towards the minster. And in a way, we were saying symbolically, the square represents kind of the earthly, represents education. The circle represents community, and the star represents spirituality. So we bring those three geometries together, and that kind of gives a building, it is a symbol, but it's also about being a community. And then the thing about the roof is it's all sloping inwards. And that's what the Romans called an impluvium, and that's where you collect all the rainwater because you don't want to let anything go. So on top of all the radiating beams is a radiating metal roof that brings all the water in. So when it rains, the circle shelters everybody inside the square, and then everybody can watch the rain, and they see the rain come round. So there you see the square and the circle, and this is just a model. That's how we explore everything in kind of model form. And this is the bracket I was telling you about, the sort of cost-effective bracket. And that's how you can see this orthogonal building, very ordinary brick building. On top of it then has this building that's much more expressive. And that's how the building radiates around the top. And that gives you, the result is, wherever you are in the building, you're seeing this kind of radiating roof. And there are the masons and the apprentices working in the workshop, and all the beams are pointing towards the center, and in the center we put nature, because at the heart, it's in a garden setting, we wanted to put nature back, so there's a wildflower garden. And like I said, when I showed you that first plan, that was a reflected ceiling plan, and in a way, a reflected ceiling plan is more important than a plan very often, because actually you want people to experience the ceiling. You don't really experience the plan, it's full of people. But the ceiling is the thing you notice. So we always try to make the ceilings beautiful. And if you're going to make the ceiling beautiful, it means you need to control the services. So Lewis Kahn talked about servant served, and here we like to separate out the services from the structure. And here what we did is we made these thick walls that venture down next to the circulation spaces so they can double function. And then around the workshop, the thick wall became kind of tool cupboards. And I'll show you how that works. So all of the services go inside here. So that makes it more economical too, but it also controls it. So it means the ceiling can remain kind of more beautiful. And here you see the apprentices. The apprentices are working with the cupboards behind them. That's where the tools are kept, with the extraction system. And underneath is the drainage system. And there's a window there that lets out the sound so that the people on the city wall can hear the masons working. This is in the administration block, and you can see the roof swooping up and down. And then this is the important building in a way. This is where the apprentices are. And the apprentices, the thick wall here has niches in, because when they come back dusty in their overalls, they take their overalls off, they take their boots off, and they leave them in the corridor, and then they go through the thick wall into their bedroom. They have individual bedrooms, and the important thing in the bedroom is obviously they all have a shower, and that shower has top light, and that top light becomes a lantern to light the room, and then their bed is also illuminated by that lantern. And then each of them has a window and a desk. It's a kind of study room, and then it has a bench on the inside for so you can have your friends around, and it has a bench on the outside. And we gave it a barn door so that you can ventilate the room but also be sociable. And that's a very important aspect. Whenever we make a kind of aperture, apertures aren't just about letting the light in. Very often they're about actually creating a kind of social interaction with people. And then the last thing about it is about collecting the rain. So all of the rain comes to the center, as I said. And then in the cathedral you have gargoyles. And you see gargoyles here in some of the buildings in South Mumbai. And here we wanted to make this gargoyle very cost effectively. So again we used our shell lace technique, where we corrugate the steel and we tailor the steel, and it's very thin steel, it's only 3 mil steel, and when it's welded together, because of the corrugations or because of it undulating, it makes it very stiff. And then when the water comes down it, that's a little bit like, you call it a chadar here, it breaks the surface of the water. And also the roof with those standing seams, each one becomes like a little stream. So when it's raining, there's a kind of celebration of the rain. And this is a passageway looking up at the beams, And then in the evening, these spaces, the relationship between the square and the circle is the thing that is celebrated. And they also have fundraising events here. So not only do the apprentices get to hang out here, but occasionally they have kind of fundraising events taking place in the courtyard here. And then, like I said, it's always looking back at the cathedral. So you can see, you know, we're making a stonemason's workshop and we're making accommodation, but we're really telling a story about place, and we're telling a story about what they do, and we're trying to bring kind of, through our placemaking process, we're trying to bring a kind of story that brings them all together and brings a kind of unity to what binds them together, which is basically craft and inside structure and light. And just to maybe finish, just to say that this project technique of making projects that are kind of story-driven, it can work for the smallest project like the medical stent we've made, but it can also work for very big projects. And in competitions, we always use it because it makes you sort of stand out as someone who's really trying to understand the brief and trying to reinterpret the brief in another way. This was a competition for a library in Taiwan, and we said that when you make a library, the most beautiful thing about a library would be that if you could see all the books in one go, so none of the books are hidden, and when you pick up a book, you could walk through the bookcase and read it in the light. And so this was a story about a kind of spiral mountain that basically kind of just got bigger and bigger and bigger. In educational terms, was sort of a metaphor for education. So each thing we're doing is almost sort of, we're trying to make a kind of creation myth, and that creation myth, you know, helps us, guide us to make something more extreme in itself, to give it a stronger identity. And the story, no one will know the story we use to make it, but it'll make its own story because it becomes more definite. So that process, asking, looking, playing, making, basically it's taken us sort of 25 years to develop it, and we're still using it today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike and Anna, to take us in such detail through your work, and it's really inspiring. You know, this whole kind of the four things and how each project goes through that. And before I invite you know, the audience to prepare with their questions and kind of ask, I wanted to actually kind of pose some thoughts that were running in my mind. One is that, you know, I was really wondering more if you could talk a little bit more about the way in which you approach your understanding of place, because placemaking is one kind of you know, important things in your practice. So what are the ways in which you, I mean, when you were talking about your projects, you were, excuse me, you were talking about, you know, the building was always set in a landscape, but we did not hear, we heard more about how it was put together. The building was put together, but what were the things that you know that constituted your idea of the place? Because how does one enter into the landscape? If you could kind of speak a little more about that.
I think we try to show that the place is a sort of synthesis of the nature, people, and place. So it's not just the natural setting, it's not just the program, it's not just the activities, you know, and people. It comes from everywhere. So it might come from the personality of the users. And then in the end, I think the entity, you shouldn't be able to distinguish, you know, the nature, people, and place. They somehow come together to make that new place.
When, you know, we say nature, people, and place, and if we just talk about place, We talk about place in terms of a physicality. Each place has a physicality. And each place has a kind of culture. And then each building you're given to do has a type, and that type has certain types of properties. And each of those types has an activity. And the activity is always very different. Before we were talking about a school, or a school can be many things. A school is a type, but not a typology. But schools can have completely different activities. So you would need to understand what are the physical relationships in the activity. So I think for us, placemaking isn't just place. Place is only like 1/3 of it. It's also the people, and it's also the relationships to nature. But in some ways, they're all about relationships, cultural relationships, as well as physical relationships.
Yeah, I meant to understand what is the way in which you then crystallize these specific things
Yes.
that'll actually help the design process. How do you translate that into a method?
Well, that's where the story comes in, and that's what we say when we get those hints from art questions, because in the first bit asking, we don't draw anything. We only use words. We make a word cloud. And the students can do that very easily because it only maybe takes a couple of hours to make a word cloud. And when we do it with students in Bath, they all do word clouds for themselves and they work in little teams. And then once they've got those words, then the quest is when they take it to the next level. And then how do they translate that into form? Well, that happens through a sort of more form-finding process of playing. So,
Please get the mic. I think they are
I
recording, so they would like you to be. Yeah.
I guess I would ask you guys, what do you think makes a place? Is it your memories? Is it who is in that space? And I think in a way that's why we're very interested in elevating that into something that's kind of almost a feeling of place. Does that make sense? So that story is sort of beyond and above nature, people, or place. And you make your own story when you go and visit this place, right? What makes a place? Anyone? What makes you remember a place?
So in one of the readings throughout my thesis project, I came across this book called Topophilia by Yi-Fu Tuan.
Yeah.
He talks about how the sensorium generated by the landscape creates a place. It can be the aroma by the flower, aroma of a fruit. And during my thesis, I looked upon these human-nature relationships, particularly how humans translate and perceive trees.
Yeah.
So a tree cannot only be a physical object, it becomes an object of a memory. It can become something from which people get like a utilitarian thing. So what in his word, what he says is a place is made through interpreting these sensorials and creating your own world by looking at the sensoriums around. So his idea of place is through these natural sensoriums that the trees and plants, flora, fauna generates.
That's very good. It's the spirit of that place.
When we're showing you this process, asking and looking, actually we haven't done any design then. Asking is just questioning, and looking is looking for kind of inspiration, whether it's in nature or whether it's in the climate or in the specific nature of the culture of the people or what it is. We don't really start designing until we start playing. And I think then it's all about, well, how do you translate that? How do we as architects translate these ideas or philosophical ideas into physical form? And I think that is the real challenge of the architect, where the translation of abstract ideas into real entities. And then once you've made a form, if you're too trapped in how you're going to make that form before you make it, you might never get around to making it. But if you can allow the form to kind of open in your mind and, you can develop it, and then later on you can figure out how you're going to make it. But you can, rather than quash the ambition. But what we also say is that you never want to make one. You want to then take one idea and then have another idea and another idea and another idea. So in our office, we always make 4 options. And that's really important, because when you do competitions, and most of the work we win is through a competition, it's really important that you explore the brief and what everybody else might be thinking and doing by doing different versions of it. And by pushing yourself to do another version, another translation, another interpretation, you end up getting to a much more interesting place. So you can take these abstract ideas, and through this process of working with the poetic and the pragmatic, you can turn abstraction into reality.
Also forcing yourself to go beyond what you normally do already. And so that's the beauty of doing multiple and really looking at what you've got in front of me. What is it telling you?
Any questions from the audience?
Is it too complicated? No? Okay.
Thanks, Anna and Mike, for that presentation. It was really lovely to see your projects. I have 2 questions. The first connects with the way in which you opened your talk and spoke about processes within nature, which you are kind of thinking of in terms of principles and form to explore in design. And the second one connects to your projects. So my first question is, what is at stake today in thinking about a nature-based approach? And I ask this because which is connected to my second question, when I see your projects, how would you distinguish them from the ways in which modernist architects would approach an engagement with buildings? Just to kind of give you an example, I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but let's say from the library, it's Etienne Louis Boulet's library, which kind of, one sees references to that. One sees references to the way in which Kant draws light into his Exeter library. The whole thing of making books being seen and illuminated by the light. And there's a particular idea of nature and the separation from nature and culture that is kind of, that marks the Enlightenment shift in all of these precedents. Or in the water tank, you see Corbusier's Villa Savoy as a ribbon window, all around, which is again, in terms of thinking about nature, the opposition, like the modernist architects would think about nature in terms of framing views, thinking about objects in opposition to the landscape outside. So there's a dualism there. So how would you kind of articulate this? What is at stake? And how does your work go beyond the ways in which the modernists explored their work, nature and culture?
I think your question is about what's at stake for modernity, or how does architecture evolve? Is that the question? Yeah.
What is at stake in a nature-based design for y'all as architectural thinkers and practitioners?
Yeah, I think
and
so.
How does the approach move beyond the oppositions between build form and landscape that were embedded in modernist architecture?
Yeah, I think certainly there are universally recognized techniques, like you say, the ribbon window, and how do you get light in, the central light. Undeniably, they're universal ones. And I would say that that's not necessarily modernity nor contemporary. But I think it's somehow the synthesis of all those things, so you can't quite place where it is or what it is. So in the playing process, there's a kind of universal and the unique, you know. So each questioning and each exploration takes you to something obviously all architects do, windows and skylights and so on, but also something quite idiosyncratic, and that's what we're chasing. And certainly we all know that we can't rely on the sort of mechanistic worldview. We want to have something that is much more directly interactive with nature, and not just interactive, but proactively communicating with nature, and proactively contributing to the good thing, the goodness in nature.
I suppose the reason for showing the seed at the beginning is to show that actually nature is ingenious, and nature solves problems that don't exist until they've solved it. The seed that can travel 5,000 miles, you know. And Le Corbusier's window doesn't belong to Villa Savoye. It actually belongs to a boat, you know, and it belongs to a hide. And in the 19th century, there were plenty of hides. And a lot of what Anna's saying, I guess, is these things are archetypes. And yes, Ledoux made a bowl that has a library in it. But the way we think, I think we think from first principles, and that's why I showed you the seed, because the seed kind of shows you what's the objective, what do I want to achieve. And I think, you know, we grew up through a time where a lot of people make references in architecture, and the architecture is always made on the back of a reference. And actually, we all need architectural literacy, and maybe we have quite high architectural literacy because I've spent 7 years of my life traveling, and we have slides of hundreds of thousands of buildings, and we know lots of architects inside out, but we don't really quote them, and we don't really think through them. We think through the principle of what we're trying to do, and then we see what they've done, and then we learn what they've done, and we always talk about we want to leapfrog them. You know, we don't want to stand on their shoulders, like people like to say. We want to jump over their back, and we want to end somewhere else and somewhere new. So what's different to what we do? Well, I think in terms of the shell lace structure, you can see there we brought tailoring, and we brought shells together in a way that I think maybe no one else had done before, and it makes an incredibly stiff structure that can be very, very thin and very, very light. And so I think that thing of trying to understand nature and principle and technology, and we don't think of it through technology, we think of it through the ambition of where we want to get to, and then we use technology as a tool to get us there. And technology is all about material and technique fused into one objective, but actually is going to kind of take you somewhere that no one's ever been before. And that can only be done through kind of experimentation. And I think it's that spirit of experimentation that excites us and makes us always want to go somewhere we've never been. And if we get somewhere we recognize, we try and avoid it. You know, we try to reverse gear, or we try to go around it. So I think, I see what you're getting at, and I think it's a really interesting thing, but how does nature teach architects to go further than modernism ever could? And a lot of that is about not really believing in architecture as technology, but believing in architecture as a kind of human-centered system that actually makes a kind of enclosures between us and the environment. So I think in that way, it's so much more about environment and art than it is about technology.
Architecture is symbol, I think. Even core believe that you need to lift the human spirit.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, I mean, to me, the work was more about archetypes, you know, so it's more Jungian in that sense. And I think it's really poetic. And also, like the sense of you work with structure and material, and there's almost this kind of visceral engagement with material, right? So it goes beyond technology in that sense. It's poetic. It's almost like you're sculpting the building. So if you can talk a little bit about the process of making this kind of, you know, visceral engagement with material and its poetics, and the engagement of artisans in it. You know, if you can really, because there's something really powerful about that poetic, goes beyond technology. You know, right, like right now we have this idea of a building and then it's technical, there's technology, but there is the archetype extends to the technology as well, right? So there's almost this kind of Jungian presence in that. So if you can speak a little about that process.
Definitely with another project Dover, which is in the book, we're chasing the story of this kind of fluidity, and therefore we began to think about concrete. We engaged with artists and fabricators in fabric foam work, you know, something very playful and organic. And I think we're letting the story lead us to that technology and lead us to really good people who want to try to do something different. And almost always the people we work with somehow believe in the stories, you know, and then they really believe they're more than just making a seafront. They're making a symbol. They're making something that is going to lift people's spirit. And that's so important because that convinces them to sort of take risks and go that extra mile.
Actually, the one Anna mentions there, the Dover seafront, in the meeting we had with the concrete contractor, he said the ramp needed to go around in a curve like this, and it's sloping down, and he says, I can't do that because that's a three-dimensional curve. I can only do flat things. And there was a packet of digestive biscuits on the table, and we just used the digestive biscuits to show that actually, like a pack of cards, you could just array the digestive biscuits and you could make a curve out of the biscuits so that each one was just a step. And actually the biscuits were like 5 mil thick, and he said, okay, we'll make them 5 mil thick steps, and that ended up becoming a lovely experience, because when a baby in a pram goes down the ramp, they can go like, because you get a kind of vibration. So somehow the story of the making and the process was, and that was with Mervyn Rodriguez too. And there's all these fantastic people around the table, and it's like really good fun, and it's just becomes a kind of experiment. I think that's part of the joy of working with such great fabricators and steel people and people who told us about the tiles, and it's asking the right question. So I think what you're doing here with questioning, if you ask a fabricator the right question, you can get a really interesting answer.
Basically ask them, how can we do this? You know, this is the story we're chasing. Help us, and they teach us a lot.
I think you also take a special joy in detailing, you know, whether it be that the singing building or the singing ringing building, or the intervention you did in order to rotate the beam in any angle. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? I think there is this. How did you think about orchestrating, say, the flute in that building? How did it? Because you wanted to break away from the image and you entered into the sense of the sound. How did that happen?
We always pride ourselves on having as few details as possible and few materials as possible when it comes to the delivery of a project once the story is evolving. So we love the fact that there's one detail, you know, for the singing ring tree, which is one key detail, which is that edge, and how to stack the pipes so that you're not puncturing it from below. So that's another detail, and that's all kind of, none of it is shouting for itself. It just has to be playing homage to the main story, you know. So if you have a story, you don't want every character to be, you know, shouting for attention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious that, again, going back to the singing building, that you don't make it a flute, but you only keep it a whistle. And a whistle. It just whistles.
Actually, it is a flute technically. It's not a whistle. we started trying to make a whistle, and we made whistles in clay, and we got hair dryers, and we were blowing hair dryers into clay whistles, and we couldn't make them make any noise. And then we knew someone who had a bellows, and he then made a whole series of holes in tubes, and we tried for 3 months to get a sound out of a pipe, and we couldn't get anything out of it. And then one day, he managed to say, well, the hole needs to be smaller, the hole needs to do this. And then it still just made like a little whisper of a sound. And it wasn't until we took some of the pipes and put them out the car window and drove up the road. And then whereas the car sped up, all of a sudden, when it got to like 5 miles an hour, it started to go like that. And it's like, we've done it, you know. But it took us 3 months, you know. So we started on that whole journey without knowing how to solve it. And maybe we wouldn't have solved it, but actually it finally did work, you know. But it doesn't always sound good. Sometimes it sounds terrible.
Yeah. But you didn't experiment with the diameters of the pipes or to see what...
The secret was the diameter had to get bigger, because we'd heard the noise in gate posts in English countryside. It's always windy, and sometimes the gates are like this, and it's really windy, you get the noise from the gate bar. But if it's lower wind, the gate comes from the post. And only when we went into that more and more, we started to... Because you know when you blow across a bottle, it's like that, you know. But if you blow across a big bottle, it's easier to get a sound than if it's a small bottle. So it was about pressure, and it was kind of beyond our understanding to begin with.
Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful to go through the whole process. My question was actually related to we've seen this whole process of y'all building a whole network around these diagrams which consist of nature, people and place. And I really was interested in how do you, so normally I know that this was a client brief that was given and it was done accordingly, but as designers, there's this anthropocentricness that comes with this idea of, following the client brief. So I really wanted to know where and how did you translate all of these agencies that was there in the diagrams into the built form, and how did you redistribute the agencies to each of those? Yeah.
I think in a way, those complexities are always there. And I suppose the art of architecture is somehow synthesizing them, and for sure, and that's why we're looking for riddles, we're looking for contradictions. And if we can crack the contradictions, which is the hardest part, you want a bridge that's not a bridge, or, we once had a similar thing with a courtyard building. So if we can crack it, I think we are really, really pushing our imagination. We're pushing ourselves as problem solvers, which architects, essentially are. So you make the problem quite challenging.
I would say, the asking and looking, they're not design, they're questioning and philosophical exploration. And actually you could just go back to the client and say, okay, you've given me this long list of accommodation and what you want, but what do you really want? What's in your heart? What's the best possible outcome you could have? And you ask them to just kind of, literally, you kind of put them on the psychoanalyst couch and say, just tell us what's in your subconscious. If you were dreaming about this building, what would it be? What would you, if your grandmother was going to be proud of you making a building, what would they want you to see you do? And they'll say, I would want to do blah, blah, blah. And you'd say, well, let's do it then. You kind of raise the ambition, but, so this thing where we ask, what was it, what is it, what could it be? It's always about raising the ambition. And that ambition sometimes is a pragmatic thing, and sometimes it's a poetic thing. And sometimes the poetic and the pragmatic rise to the level of a kind of symbol. So I think that's what the interpretation is about.
When we do it with the students and even with the clients, it's definitely like a kind of word play, you know, so it's never like, what do you want? Because actually, we don't know. He doesn't know, she doesn't know. So it's impossible, but these word associations are really interesting and very playful, very expansive. So you need to kind of go beyond the generic. In the beginning, it's always very generic, the things people say. And then by the end of the session, becomes much more interesting. And that's why we then have to connect different words together.
In my PhD, I quoted a British architect, Dennis Lasdon, who was a modernist architect, and he said, your job is to give the client what they never even dreamt of, you know, because you've got to take it to a higher level.
There's a question from YouTube from one of our students by Varun Shetty. He's saying that it's lovely to see your work. I was intrigued when you spoke about type and your attempt to develop a new one. Could you explain what this means and how you approach the process? The type, basically how you approach the type and how you reinvent it in your work.
He means the question during the questioning stage. What is type?
How do you kind of articulate to respond?
So I think we want to go to the root of that type. So if it were a school, we wouldn't say, oh, it's a school. If we would say that is where you speak, or that is where you sit, and that is where you communicate. Something much more pure and perhaps philosophical and spiritual. That is what we'd be looking for.
I think type is often confused with predictability, because type is, if we know what it is, it's a type. And you say, oh, you know, he or she, they're a type. That means they've been defined and put in a pigeonhole. And actually what you want to do with type is take it out of a pigeonhole and reimagine it somehow. So, and type is so different to typology, as we talked about before. Typology is the formal arrangement of the building, but type is kind of the name of what the building does. That's all it is. And so there's a massive amount of interpretation in really trying to find the depth in that. And that's why you have to look at type and activity together, because the things that take place inside the building, the human activity, the human relationships, they have much more to offer to you than the type, because the type is obviously a cliche, because that's how it got called a type. But the activity tells you much more about the human endeavor that you should be taking.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Please pass the mic to Prasad.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I mean, I kind of, got interested in the idea of chasing stories, right? That's something that you talk about. And the idea of starting with a story about a seed, which, has a moth in it. There's something about the structure of it, something unpredictable about it going. There's 15 years that pass by. So the story has, a lot going on. And I was wondering if it was to tell, what kind of stories you would want to tell about a building, or what kind of stories sort of go into making the building itself, which, to me seems more than the story of the nature in terms of its structure per se, right? And in that sense, the way you describe and sort of the building has a lot more going in terms of its stories than, just the notion of the biomimicry of the nature itself. There's a lot. So I was wondering what kind of stories you would want your building to tell, right? What kind of stories you would want your buildings to tell. And the other was also, I was just looking at the process of it, and there was one of our students who was doing a study on, the role of AI in architecture. and had a very similar kind of, organizational diagram of how algorithms work. But it's just that at every stage, what he would say is that there's a sense of a diffusion, right, which is, everything is broken down to layers and then aggregated and again broken down to layers. Right? And there's something different about the diagrams that you make of your process, which is sort of at each stage, right, there's something else that gets introduced, which is largely, a question or a quest or a curiosity, which is, and I was wondering if there's a way to, think about it in terms of an algorithm that, allows one to rework, the processes of making architecture, but not like where the verb of diffusion gets, complicated more through what the kind of diagrams that you're making. And so, I was wondering, and it was, briefly looking at the book, there's something on the AI, artificial intelligence and architecture, and I was wondering, where do you see your work and the process in relationship to this whole idea of the algorithm and how that works? So yeah, one was about just the kind of stories that, you feel you're building, wholes, right? Which is beyond the story of nature and its structure and that sort of, and the second is about the process and how do you see the work, right? Just in terms of like the stages that it has and how you think about in terms of, the whole current scene of architecture or artificial intelligence that does a work of thinking. Yeah.
I think certainly you can automate this process, but actually the key thing is how do you recognize when it's the right thing, and you could also feed architectural literacy to AI so that they say, oh yes, that's a good scheme, right? But in a way, this is where I think it's super interesting. What really lifts your heart? What lifts the human spirit? I don't think AI would be able to sort of choose. AI could keep generating hundreds of options, and perhaps we make the diagram look quite neat. But the reality of it is we do a lot of U-turns and we get somewhere with the processing and we think, oh no, that's not the right thing. We go back to look at the words. So I would say it's the human mind and imagination, work in a very, very interesting way, unexpected way. And it's really the sense you get, when you work with clients, when you work with the people you're doing the project for. Very difficult to describe that. You make that judgment, when you have four options. Which one's the right one?
I think AI has an awful long way to go until, its name, artificial intelligence, it's just nowhere near as intelligent as human intelligence. And it's going to be an awful long, if you look at an awful lot of terrible work that's been done with AI, there's almost no intelligence in it in terms of structure, environment, or construction. So it's so embarrassing, so much of it. But that doesn't mean that AI doesn't have a fantastic potential. And I think we believe that AI could be a really good thing if it's used well. But I think what the human intelligence has, is AI is a kind of conscious thing, but ours is a subconscious thing. And actually our subconscious is so much more intelligent than our consciousness. And I think somehow we can tap into things, or we can kind of float and drift around things that AI simply isn't capable of doing. I think human beings is a 1 million year of intelligence and evolution, and the relationship between our hand and our mind, it's going to take AI quite a long time to replace that. But just because it's not good at the moment, it's maybe just in first year, but it might get much better. So we're not anti it, we're for it as a tool, and I think we'd like to use it in the future too. And then to come to your first question about the kind of story, I think the story is often, when we're telling stories, people are confused by what is the story, you know, and I think the story is often just really when we show the singing ringing tree, the way we won the competition, we were in a great big hall in Bradford, in Burnley, and we just told a story about a man walking up a hill in the mist with a dog, and the dog starts to bark, and the dog runs off and runs up the hill, and he has to run after the dog, and he goes much further up the hill than he's ever gone before. And then when he gets there, the dog's barking at this tree that's singing in the wind. And then the mist clears, and then the man sees the view from the top of the hill, and he rushes back to the town and tells everybody in the town about this tree on top of the hill that's singing a tune. And it's a bit like the story of the Pied Piper of Hamlet, but in this case a good one, you know. And then what happens is the story goes from mouth to ear to mouth to ear, and all the people in the town go to the top of the hill and have a look at the great view and say how beautiful the town they live in is. So the story is really about an experience, and the story is about the objective of a building and what's the essence of it. You know, what is the sort of primal thing we're trying to achieve? So I think that's what the story is more about, the final experience, and they don't need to know what story we use to get there. People can have their own story about what that building is.
Thanks, Anna and Mike, for your presentation. It was really lovely. So my question, I was thinking about what Anna, you spoke about, you know, what is a place? And I was thinking about, like, we often talk about architectural site, but you know, it essentially is a place of intensities, of overlapping interests, and it often has this something that goes beyond the physical, like a metaphysical sense to it. And I think what even Prasad and Mike were talking about, the stories become a way of holding the fantasy. You know, how we make sense of the metaphysical is through a story, and then that becomes a way how we want to experience the place. So throughout all the cases that you presented, I was thinking, you know, there's a very clear intent of of the client in terms of what they want to be built in the place that you're talking about. But if you were to, and then the word cloud becomes your method to, you know, put all of them and then kind of think through them and then generate the riddles out of it. So would you think if it were to be a site, to be a place which has overlaps and, you know, contested kind of interests and power dynamics, and perhaps a very when you say, like, even the community which wanted you to build a bridge, you know, perhaps if the place has communities which are conflicting with each other, then do you think the word cloud would become as a method to, you know, kind of delayer it, or if there's something else that could come up as a method to reach to the archetype?
Did you say what if a place has a community that doesn't agree with each other?
Perhaps communities that don't agree with each other, or perhaps there are power dynamics within them.
Or they absolutely never agree with each other from our experience. And therein lies the beauty of, you get these riddles and contradictions. You know, here's this and here's that, and how do you find something that elevates everyone's aspiration and imagination and makes them feel, yes, that's the right thing to do. And not so much in terms of I want a table or a chair, but I want, you know, it's definitely something much more mysterious than that. And hence we quite often look to nature for those powerful values, because they unify people.
And actually, maybe it's a question of inspiration, because the word cloud is just a guide. It's like the dots on my Google map. It's where we need to go. And actually, where you need to go is to find the inspiration, to show the people who disagree, to find something they might agree on. Because, you know, by looking at nature and finding things in culture and nature that will bring people together and uniting it in a story, that's how you bring them together. And what you need to do is those things need to be kind of cross-cultural, because when we're in looking, it's the wall of inspiration, and we use the words unique and universal. And the reason we use unique is because we want it to be about that particular place, and the reason we use universal is because we want it to be about every man. more in the Jungian sense, more in the sense that the ambition can join people together because they're going to find commonality in it. So somewhere in between the unique and the universal, you can bring these people together. You have to believe that, else you'd never set off.
I suppose the last thing to add is the cross-generational perspective, and hence the is, was, could be. So I remember, and also when you show people something physical and perhaps sensual, it goes beyond what they have in their heads, right? So I remember giving a presentation to a community very adamantly against the project. And at the end, we had a go at designing something just so they have something to sort of get a sense of what it could be. And an older lady came up to me and said, I realized, and I didn't tell her this, but she told me that I realized it's not for me, this is for my grandchildren, and I thought that was incredibly touching. I didn't tell her, well, we're going to use interesting tools, we're going to make this a very timeless, we're going to make sure this endures, the test of time. I didn't say those things, but she got it from just, looking at the parameters of what we were designing with. So I found that really touching.
I think that's the round of questions for today. It's lovely that your work was able to kind of open up so many different kinds of questions, and the students were able to kind of connect it to their own work and their own inquiries. So I really thank you to patiently address each of them. Thank you, Mike and Anna, for coming and sharing your work with us. And thank you all for engaging in this conversation. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.